Right now, in a mountain in central Iran, there's a stockpile of enriched uranium that nobody is currently trying to reach. Not because it's impossible to find. Because pulling it out safely, under the eyes of every intelligence agency on the planet, is a project measured in years, and the country that built it has bigger fires to put out first. That single fact tells you more about where this conflict actually stands than any headline about ceasefires or retaliation ever could. Here's the sequence that got us here. For roughly 2 decades, Iran ran one of the most patient weapons programs in modern history. Centrifuges spinning at Natanz and Fordow, slowly enriching uranium past the levels needed for civilian power plants. By 2025, various reports indicated the country had accumulated a stockpile enriched to around 60%, a short technical step from weapons grade. Alongside that sat a missile arsenal, thousands of units stored underground across the country, and a network of allied armed groups in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria that led Tehran Project Force without ever putting its own soldiers in the line of fire. It was a strategy built on time, and for a long time, time worked. Then, in June 2025, American and Israeli strikes hit Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan in a single coordinated operation. The White House called it a total success. Some intelligence assessments, including a report that leaked to the press, suggested the damage had set the program back by months rather than destroying it outright. Iran itself acknowledged serious damage while downplaying its scale, calling it manageable. Both things can be true at once, and that ambiguity is worth sitting with rather than resolving into a headline. The quiet that followed lasted only a few months. In February 2026, strikes resumed under a campaign officials began calling Epic Fury, this time hitting missile production sites, command centers, radar stations, and coastal defense systems well beyond the nuclear program. Iran fired back at American bases and Israeli cities. Tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz stopped. Insurers pulled coverage for ships bound for Iranian waters. A ceasefire was announced, broke down, and was announced again. Through all of it, one question kept getting louder: even once the shooting stops, does Iran actually come back from this the way it always has before? That's the question worth answering honestly, piece by piece, because the physical damage is only half the story. Start with the uranium itself, since that's where the foreign minister's admission matters most. The material didn't just take decades to accumulate, it took a level of technical patience few countries have ever sustained. Now it's reportedly buried under collapsed rock inside a mountain that was hit with some of the most powerful bunker-penetrating weapons ever used. Even if part of that stockpile survived intact, recovering it, verifying it, and converting it into anything usable is a years-long project, and every stage of it has to happen in full view of a world now watching Iranian nuclear sites more closely than at any point in the program's history. It's worth noting that not everyone agrees on the scale of the setback. Israeli officials have described the program as damaged but not eliminated, and some assessments put the delay at months, not years. So this isn't a case where every expert agrees Iran's ambitions are permanently over. What they do largely agree on is that Iran lost time, lost material, and lost the secrecy that made slow, quiet progress possible in the first place, and that combination is what separates this moment from past setbacks Iran absorbed and outlasted. Then there's the arsenal that was supposed to make any of this leverage. Iran's missile stockpile functioned as an insurance policy of sorts, a reason for rivals to think twice before pushing too hard. A large share of it was fired, destroyed in storage, or damaged in place during this latest round of fighting. The factories and the engineers to build more still exist, but production under constant satellite surveillance is slower and riskier than it used to be. Every rebuild becomes visible, and everything visible becomes a target again. Worse, many of Iran's more advanced missiles relied on precision guidance components quietly sourced from foreign suppliers, and those supply chains are drying up fast as countries that once looked the other way grow far more cautious about being caught helping Iran rearm mid-conflict. The same pattern shows up along the coast. Iran spent years building anti-ship missile batteries, radar stations, and fast boat bases specifically to hold the Strait of Hormuz hostage whenever it needed leverage, since a huge share of the world's oil moves through that narrow passage. That threat only works if the network behind it stays intact and coordinated. Coastal missile sites have been repeatedly struck, shipbuilding facilities damaged, and radar installations knocked out one by one, leaving fragments where a unified system used to be. Rebuilding it means visible construction, and visible construction gets spotted from orbit before it's finished. None of this even touches the hardest loss to reverse, which is people. Iran lost a significant number of experienced commanders, engineers, and technicians in this conflict, the kind of people who understand not just how a system works on paper but how it behaves under real pressure. That knowledge takes years, sometimes decades, to build, and it can't be transferred quickly. There's also an uncomfortable pattern worth acknowledging. The people most likely to become targets in a conflict like this are often the most visible and capable ones, which can leave a younger, less experienced generation trying to rebuild without the mentors who would normally guide them. Underneath all of it sits the money problem. Iran's economy depends heavily on oil exports, and shipping disruptions through Hormuz, spiking insurance costs, and damaged export terminals have hit that revenue hard, on top of sanctions that were already squeezing the country before this conflict began. Rebuilding nuclear facilities, missile production, and coastal defenses simultaneously requires steady financing that Iran currently doesn't have, and every dollar spent on emergency repair is a dollar not spent on long-term rebuilding. It's worth stepping back here, because this isn't only an Iranian story. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and Israel have spent years building their security planning around the assumption of a powerful, unpredictable Iran across the water. A weaker Iran doesn't automatically mean a calmer region. Some officials in those countries may feel safer. Others worry that a cornered Iran with less to lose becomes more unpredictable, not less. And that's a genuinely open question regional analysts are still arguing over, not a settled one. There's a comparison worth making here, and it's not to Germany or Japan after World War II, since both of those countries rebuilt with massive outside investment and open access to global trade, things Iran simply doesn't have right now. The closer comparison is Iraq, which spent decades rebuilding its military and institutions after war and sanctions, with real international support and its own oil wealth, and that recovery was still slow, uneven, and arguably incomplete decades later. Iraq didn't even have to rebuild a nuclear program under active surveillance. That comparison alone should temper anyone assuming Iran simply bounces back on the usual timeline. So what would actual recovery require? Years of uninterrupted access to rebuild nuclear and missile sites without new strikes. Billions in steady oil revenue flowing without sanctions or shipping disruptions. A new generation of engineers and technicians reaching the skill level of the one just lost, which historically takes 10 to 20 years even in peacetime. Foreign suppliers willing to risk exposure to provide advanced components again. And, hardest of all, a world willing to stop watching closely enough to let any of this happen quietly. Right now, every one of those conditions is either partly or completely missing, and that's simply what the current picture looks like when you lay it out honestly rather than react to whichever headline moves fastest. Iran isn't disappearing from the map. It still has people, resources, and the will to keep functioning as a state, and no honest observer should bet on total collapse. But the version of Iran that existed before this conflict, patient, methodical, quietly building toward long-term goals for 40 years, will be extraordinarily difficult to reconstruct exactly as it was. Too much time has been lost, too much material destroyed, too many of the people who understood these systems best are no longer available to rebuild them, and every future attempt now happens under a level of scrutiny that simply didn't exist a few years ago. Whether that gap between the old Iran and whatever comes next turns out to be permanent or temporary is a question history hasn't answered yet. Which side of that you find more believable probably says as much about how you weigh patience against pressure as it does about Iran itself.